put on where you are in the world. Just throw in your city and state or your country, where you're living. If you want to put that in the chat, that just helps us to know kind of who's in this space as we kind of bring some other people into this conversation. Wes, where are you calling in from?
I am in Wheaton, Illinois.
It's fantastic. So I'm calling in from Cody, Wyoming, the middle of nowhere. I usually get to be the person that people say, I've never met someone from Wyoming before. And I usually get to be that first person. So it's great to have you guys as we have this conversation. So, just a little orientation. What we'll plan to do is give people just a couple more minutes to jump into this space. And then Wes is going to share with us for about 25 to 30 minutes some core content that he's prepared. And then we'll aim to open it up for questions and provide an opportunity for some dialogue around this content and kind of what it brings up in your space. So, as you're listening, if you have key questions, feel free to jot those in the chat or to hold those with you because we'll have an opportunity to share those at the end through either uh, an out loud question or you can put it in the chat. And then Wes will get through as many as he can after his kind of core content. So I'm just looking here to see where people are from. If you're just jumping in, we'd love to have you throw in the chat where you're calling in from in the world. We've got some people
If-
from, oh,
And
go
if
ahead,
there's any
Wes.
difficult questions, I'm just going to refer those to either Lance or Bruce.
Perfect. We've got additional support in the room, which is great. And we've got people calling from Missouri, Kansas, Chicago, Germany, Kentucky, Colorado. It's exciting to hear people from all different spaces coming in to have this conversation. Um, we are really excited to hear from Wes. So we will probably continue to have people trickling in. But Wes, I'm going to go ahead and just punt it to you and allow you to kind of get us started, and I'll keep fielding the chat as people jump in.
Great. I'm just looking at everybody who's joining this, and it's not too often that the different worlds that I live in kind of collide like this and converge. There's people from the micro church that I attend here, 100 Movements, obviously, Modus Day, colleagues from different seminaries around the world. So yeah, I'm really honored that you all are giving part of your day to this. I hope it's worthwhile. And if you're here and you haven't met me before or heard about me, I'm sure you're very familiar with Alan Hirsch. Through his teaching and his writing, Alan has been encouraging a paradigm shift in how we understand our role as followers of Jesus in the world. And Alan spends a lot of time talking about how we can go through a change from Christendom mindset to a more faithful way of inhabiting our world through making disciples and being part of God's movement. So I'm trying to say something very similar to Alan, but I think maybe with some new terminology, and then also from my perspective as a researcher of church planting movements and disciple making movements in least reached contexts in the majority world. So today, what I really want to focus on, obviously, you see the title here. We're talking about the types of churches that are in movements. The subtitle is Recovering the Church as a Living Movement. What I would like to do is also talk about Christendom and our hermeneutic. Okay, so I want to challenge the eisegesis of institutional church paradigms that I believe are imposed on Scripture. And I'd like to argue for a more movemental ecclesiology that aligns with biblical patterns. So when we go through this presentation, that'll do two things for us. Number one, that's going to give us a missional framework for understanding and explaining the breakthrough that movements are seeing in unreached frontier contexts. But also, one of the sayings that I heard recently that I'm kind of modifying for use here is that I believe that these church planting movements, they're not just important for missions or for the majority world, but it's actually a midwife so to speak, to encourage missional and movemental renewal for recommissioning the Western Church for movement once again. So it's like a midwife that's going to help us give birth to some new ideas, looking at the phenomenology of movements as we reflect on Scripture. So let's just get right into it. I think this is a very learned crew as I'm looking at some of your faces. And so let's just kind of dive right into this. The first thing we want to say, Jesus started a movement, right? Jesus was the Messiah. He could have done a lot of different things. He could have tried to overthrow the Roman occupation. He could have tried to start a community development project. He could have tried to start and plant churches, so to speak. But what did Jesus do? He gathered people together. He hung out with a bunch of broken people, and he started a movement of disciples making disciples. From the very beginning, the church was a multiplying movement. And Christianity is itself the largest and most successful movement in history. And just by the fact that you're here today, you're evidence of that. Yet, as we know, a lot of churches, they fail to reproduce. And I know many churches that I'm familiar with have never reproduced. And there's also times where the church finds itself in a certain situation in a period of decline. We're experiencing that right now in the US. So, to help explain this, there's a concept called that Andrew Walls talks about. He says that church history is serial, not progressive, meaning that churches and movements, they're just like people. They all have lifespans, right? They rise and they fall. And so this is more specifically this concept of institutionalization that explains the loss of movement dynamics, where movements become more formalized and regulated. And you see this gradual shift from decentralized networks, as we see in the New Testament, to more hierarchical structures. This is sociologically inevitable. David Bosch says this: we have to ask whether it is fair to expect a movement to survive only as a movement. Either the movement disintegrates or it becomes an institution. This is simply a sociological law. Every religious group that started out as a movement and managed to survive did so because it was gradually institutionalized. And so I think in the way Bosch understands sociology, to him, this explains the trajectory of the early Jesus movement towards institutionalization in the Roman Empire. And so it's important to note that institutions, they're sociologically necessary in our world. They're not inherently bad. I think we need mega churches in mega cities. And I think a mission-shaped institutional church has a lot to offer. But even in movements, institutions are needed for funding, for training, for shepherding. And so the failure to recognize this dynamic that Bosch is talking about is harmful for both the emergence and the sustainability of movements. But I would like to nuance what Bosch says in a minute. But let me just explain this a little bit more. I took this from a Mission Frontiers article that came out around 10 years ago. It says that there's basically 4 stages of institutionalization that churches always go through in a context. So if you just look at these, I'll turn on my laser pointer here. You just look at these icons here. This is a house church. This is a church building, the priesthood of all believers, and institutional training. In frontier contexts, you typically start out with some very simple churches, or they might not even be churches. They just might be Bible studies. But then when there's a lot of ministry, evangelism, prayer, disciple making, and a huge emphasis on the priesthood of all believers, you get into the movement phase. But eventually the church starts to deal with issues, this is inevitable, of unity, health, doctrine. And so it starts to organize itself in the formalizing phase by introducing new requirements for leaders and moving into dedicated buildings. And then when a church is finally institutionalized, all the way in this phase 4 here, you get these simple churches, they don't really exist anymore. And then you get this functional laity and clergy divide in the church. And after this comes then the decline phase, which we are in right now in the West. So, like I said, institutions, they're sociologically necessary, but this helps kind of explain that process. However, I want to nuance what Bosch said, and I would like to quote these 2 well-known theologians, Daryl Guter and Tim Keller, and disagree with all 3 of them. as Dr. Humble here, I'm sorry I ripped off that cover from Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. I think part of the problem is that we understand institutionality. We haven't quite developed a theology or a missiology of institutionality. And when I say the word institutional, we might have very different understandings of what that is, right? So Bosch has played with that quote that I said earlier. He's played a really outsized role in our understanding of institutionality, particularly in the missions community. So Guter says this: the problem is not that the church is institutional, but how it is institutional. And Keller says from the beginning, the church was both an institution and a movement. But what I think all three of these, including Bosch, are referring to is not institution as much as it is structure. Every social grouping needs structure. Every organism has an internal logic called a DNA that describes how it organizes itself. And sociologists, when you read about institutionality, they'll tell you that there's a number of trade-offs between movements and institutions, between flexibility and stability, between empowerment and cohesion, between risk tolerance and legacy building. And actually, institutionality exists on a spectrum, so it's not like you're institutional or not. So I define institutionality as the degree to which a church embodies bureaucratic, hierarchical, and static organizational characteristics that prioritize maintenance over multiplication. There's a really good metaphor called the trellis and the vine. You've probably heard it before. If you're watching a vine grow and you build a trellis to support the growth of the vine, well, that's a wise use of structure and a wise use of an institution. What we typically do, however, is we will you can see the vine growing and you could bring back the growth of the vine and then strap it to the trellis. That's actually a not very wise use of institutions. And that is the process of institutionality. There's this really good book too that I've been reading, or that I read last year, Becoming a Missionary Church, by Goheen and Sheridan, where he talks about Leslie Newbigin, and he looks at three major conversations that we've gone through in the West to where people have tried to be more missional in our culture: the emerging church conversation, the missional church conversation, and then Tim Keller's center church conversation. But I want to just read how Goheen and Sheridan, how they define, how they talk about what they call an anti-institutional bias among, I think, probably people like me. He says this: if the church wants to have any lasting influence and continue through history, then taking an institutional form is inevitable. The institutional church is the place where the life of the kingdom is channeled to God's people. The church must organize itself in some way in terms of leadership and practices. A liquid church will die in the long run, and its, quote, members will not be sustained and nourished. That's on page 177 of this. It's a very fine book, but I think you can see here they're really confusing institutionality with structure. Institutional is one way that we can organize ourselves. We can go into networks, etc. But I digress. Sometimes we are much more influenced by institutional models than we are aware. So that brings us into this next part of our presentation here. Once you start to see this, you really can't unsee it. So beginning with Constantine in the 4th century, Christendom, this concept where church and state are more or less merged, it merges church with national identity, and that makes Christianity territorial. And so hermeneutically, what this happened in Christian theology was this shifted our theological framework to interpret church experience through national experience and vice versa. And even though Christendom is no longer, it's died out in the last 200 years, we all seem to think of church in this one static image. And scholars refer to this as cognitive entrenchment, and a term that is used often in 100 Movements conversation with Rich and Allen and Lindsay. They talk about paradigm blindness. This is just another way of looking at it. Jehu Hansel says that much of Western missions is still shaped by Christendom's assumptions. And communally, we all tend to think that there is one essence or one normative expression of faith. And a lot of times in conferences and webinars that we all attend, just like this, or in missiological or theological conversations, when we say the word church, we just mean this static, triumphalistic, institutional definition. We might call this static view in our setting here, a Protestant micro-Christendom ecclesiology. So cognitive entrenchment happens when there is deep expertise in a certain paradigm, and that deep expertise creates resistance to new perspectives. And this is especially common among experts like theologians. So Hans Kuhn, who is a well-known Catholic theologian, he lost his license to teach as a Catholic after he wrote this book. And when you read this quote, you'll see why. He says, our concept of the church is basically influenced by the form of the church at any given time. All too easily, the church can become a prisoner of the image it has made for itself by the theologians of the age. And I think this helps explain how our historical paradigms, they become rigid, they tend to limit innovation. And actually, anthropologists, they'll tell you that institutions, they think for you, right? If you join a church, or if you join a company or a corporation, and suddenly you're part of it, you start to see all these norms of behaviors and values that are kind of unspoken, but you have to follow them. And it's too easy for us to do what they call cognitive offloading. We just let the institution think for us and dictate these norms and expectations. And there's another concept called, this is really important. It's been my new favorite word. It's called isomorphism. So iso is the same, morph is the shape, and ism is the process of taking the same shape, meaning that in a certain locale, sociologists can demonstrate that different organizations in the same context begin to mimic each other. And churches can very easily mimic institutional blueprints, and this reinforces the traditional paradigm. So even starting with Ignatius in the early 2nd century, he was having to deal with all the growth that was going on. And I don't think he had bad motives, but Ignatius said, he was the first one to say to obey the bishop is to obey God. Well, what's he doing? He's copying the structures of Rome and the first century Mediterranean world by setting up a hierarchy. This isomorphism. And the result is that we're kind of all drawn into this institutional inertia that confines our thinking about the church. Jeff Christopherson says it really well. He summarizes our problem well. He says the 21st century church looks like a 19th century congregation applying an ecclesiology from the 16th century in a context that is increasingly like the 1st century. So our challenge then is to recognize how this cognitive entrenchment, how it influences our missiology, and then this impulse that we have to say, okay, well, we don't want Christendom. We just want the biblically pure or original church. But we know that that is an impulse that is neither new nor neutral. That brings us into what we might call the original simplicity fallacy. I asked AI to make me this hat. So this is not a real hat, and I hope nobody wears this hat. This fallacy, it's there in political discourse too. It's when the origins of a movement or an ideology that they represent a romanticized perfection that has been corrupted over time. So when we apply the original simplicity fallacy to this conversation, there's 2 problems. Number one, this fallacy disregards the need for contextualization. And number 2, it denies the complexities of the early stages of our faith. So what makes our movemental conversation different, right? What makes The Forgotten Ways by Hirsch? What makes it different? Well, we are avoiding nostalgia, right? We know that the early church was by no means pristine or pure, right? Did Jesus start a healthy movement? Did Paul continue that healthy movement? Right? The New Testament gives us some very uncomfortable evidence, right? Look at 1 Corinthians, or look at Jesus's rebuke to the churches in Revelation 2 and 3. what we're trying to do is seek a hermeneutical grounding in New Testament principles, not a replication of early forms. And so I think that church planting movements and disciple making movements, they serve as contemporary models that illustrate these New Testament principles, not some sort of idealized past, right? Every theology always has a conversation partner. And so what I'd like to do for understanding a way to look at church in a way that's going to be reaching people who it's not normally going to be reaching, a place where we can get to where the church is moving and breaking down barriers and going into unexpected places, that our dialogue partner is church planting movements in the majority world. So this is a little bit of my preliminary analysis. So I'm going to give 6 features of a movemental ecclesiology. The first is that a movemental church does not just take one form, but adapts according to the needs of the context. My favorite metaphor for this is the immortal jellyfish, right? It's the only organism in the world that when it finds itself needing to adapt in order to survive, it is able to go through a reverse metamorphosis, revert back to a larva state, fall back to the ocean floor, and reproduce in a polyp colony. And so it adapts and it reproduces in order to survive. This is an organism that actually it thrives under chaos and it thrives under uncertainty. And that my point in using this analogy is that the New Testament does not teach that our ecclesiology is just evolving to one single fixed model that's relevant for all places and times, right? We can sometimes in these conversations or in our broader Christian world, we get this sense of ecclesiological Darwinism. Like I talk to people in really high liturgical churches, and they'll look at a simple church and they'll say, sometimes even condescendingly, oh, you're just a primitive church. It's okay. You'll get to our level someday. And there's this prejudice against simple churches. The point is that churches and movements, they're always adaptive. They're responsive to changing contexts. Number 2 is this idea of an emerging ecclesiology. So traditionally, we have this idea, we plant a church in order to make disciples, but movements reverse that order. Because if biblical church planting is evangelism and discipleship that results in new churches, then church formation is a process. And so the New Testament presents church not as a product to be planted, but as a community that emerges as women and men are formed and united in Christ through baptism, training, and faithfulness. And I love this quote from Neil Cole. He says, in movements, the point is to lower the bar of how church is done so that anyone can do it, and raise the bar of what it means to be a disciple so that they will do it, right? We tend to do the opposite in our Christendom kind of mindset. We have a really high bar for the church, and that church is going to continue to operate as long as the funding continues. And even with the way that we do church in our Protestant micro-Christendom ecclesiology, we have created the conditions where it's very possible to be a Christian and not a disciple. This is an unfortunate byproduct of our Christendom ecclesiology. Movements, they focus on disciple making, and church emergence is that second order effect that comes downstream in the process. Third is this embedded ecclesiology, right? Many of our form where churches emerge from a context and people do church where they are. This is a picture in South Asia, men and women, and there's a small child sitting right here. They're sitting together. People are like, well, why are the women sitting on the ground? I'm like, let me just tell you how radical this is in this conservative Muslim context. What we tend to do instead of the embedded ecclesiology where people they become and they be the church, they do and they be the church where they are, we extract people out of their context. And so it's not missional incarnational, as Alan would say, but it's more excarnational, to use a term from the great Charles Taylor. Fourth is this networked ecclesiology. In Acts chapter 13, the church, when it talks about the church in Antioch and it lists these 5 probably householders, in Antioch, ministry had been happening there for more than 10 years. And they likely had a network of house churches. When they said the church, it was referring to this network. And so these individual leaders, these prophets and teachers, they oversaw some of these small house church networks. And Alan will tell us too, all true Jesus movements are essentially decentralized networks and not institutions. And in a decentralized network, any part can reproduce the whole. I think, and how we understand institutionality in our fallen human nature, I think when we have a social grouping, what do we tend to do is our automatic impulse, and everybody does this. We centralize authority and then set up a hierarchy. And movements resist this impulse. It's about equipping and releasing people from ministry under the authority of Jesus, right? The Reformation recaptured the priesthood of all believers in theory, but movements try to reclaim it, or a movemental framework tries to reclaim that in practice. Fifth is a generative ecclesiology. And this just means basically that the outputs are greater than the inputs, right? But when I'm researching movements, I ask them to draw me the churches that they're currently overseeing, and tell me how they got started, and just to tell me the story. And so this was also in South Asia. You can see this was the first church that this guy started. It was a small group Bible study. And then this eventually reproduced 1, 2, 3, 4 generations, and you can see multiple streams of 4 generations. This is an emerging movement. And the point is church is a family. And families don't just grow bigger, but they multiply relationally across generations. This is quite different and much more sustainable than models of institutional duplication. You can also see the network where that idea comes in there. And finally, church planting movements or disciple making movements, they prioritize reproducible communities and generational growth. And so local churches, they multiply, or they merge, or then they dissolve as issues like security and saturation and social dynamics, as all those things shift. And so transience is a design feature. It's not a flaw. It's about keeping the network light, adaptive, and mission oriented. And so structure is only built as the movement requires. So movemental churches, they're typically less stable because they're oriented towards multiplication rather than institution. There was an article that was going around Substack a little while ago, and the author, who was a pastor, also a pastor, he was saying that he was making a strong case that churches must be institutional by nature, and his main argument was because he wanted his church to outlive him. Well, the average lifespan of a church in North America is 75 years, about as long as a human lives. And so I actually sent this article to Alan, and he responded. He says, perhaps Jesus never intended that we build institutions, but that disciples who make disciples, et cetera, is the way that you hand down tradition. And I think that's just a nice, it reminds me of 2 Timothy 2:2, right? These things you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, and trust these to faithful people who will be able to teach others also. That there's this chain reaction where we're continuing to make disciples. So just to summarize, our movemental ecclesiology is adaptive. It's not just taking one form, it's emerging, it's not planted, it's embedded, it's not extracted out of the context, it's network. These are not institutional islands. It's generative, meaning they reproduce, and it's transient. Not that the church has a mission, but the mission has a church. So this brings us now to something that we talk a lot about, right? How do we get to movement in the West? This is the $1,000,000 question, or maybe this is the Jesus we're out of wine question. We need some new wineskins, that's for sure. I actually have a lot to say about this, but our time is short. So if you see the Great De-Churching, 40 million members, the church has lost 40 million members this century alone. That's an incredible stat. And church closures far outpace church starts. And if every system is perfectly designed to get the results it's getting, well, then church planting movements, they give us these critical insights that are often just overlooked in so much of our Western missiological models. And I haven't been to Exponential, but I've watched several of the sessions there, and that's like the number one conference for talking about multiplication. obviously with the term exponential, but there's very little talk about new forms of church. You see some of this in the microchurch conversation, but how can we bring more movemental theology into our conversation? That's, I think, the next phase of where we're heading. But I mentioned this at the beginning that we're living in the midst of this paradigm shift. The paradigm shift, though, isn't from institutions to movements. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. I think the future of a Western ecclesiology requires embracing a diversity of forms and expressions. So rather than replacing institutional models with movements, I think we just need a plurality of expressions and we need to fight for unity. Movemental ecclesiology really needs to cooperate with traditional and historical structures. But we don't quite have that proof of concept movement in the West that where we can go and look at in places in the majority world, we can see movements. We could do that missiological translation to near culture context, but in the West, it just seems still quite different. And so, at the least, I think this should encourage us with experimentation to see how we can have forms of church that are going to multiply in unexpected places. I mean, the New Testament was very disruptive for the theology of its day, and I think movements are playing that similar disruptive prophetic role for the church today. So, how can we apply this movemental ecclesiology, at least the phenomenology of it, to our context in the West? So, I'm not going to give you a lot of practical insights here. I would recommend a really great Substack. I think Brian's on the call. Brian could put it in the chat here. The Starfish University, I think it's called. Really good, helpful, practical things. What I'm trying to do here is operate at the level of our movemental imagination or our movemental hermeneutic. And I think it's just because in order to apply some of these. So I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but I'm hoping to stir some of our thinking, some of our presuppositions. And I think it's because the missional conversation is pretty stale, right? If you tell me you're a missional church, I'm not even sure I know what that means. Um, and it's not that it's bad. I think the missional conversation has been great, but it just feels like it's run out of steam. And so the concept of modus Dei is something I mean, I kind of want to give the next 20 years of my life to developing a deeper theology and missiology of Modus Dei. And I'd love to geek out some more with you on this, but it's really Modus Dei is just, Missio Dei is the sending of God, the mission of God, right? Where God in himself is sent, God in himself and his nature, he's missional. Well, Modus Dei is saying that God in his nature is movement. And so the idea is that a theology of church's movement has to flow from a theology of God as movement. And so Christendom theology and what our systematic categories have done in so much of Western theology is really put God in these very static categories, whereas Modus Dei is much more dynamic, right? So we have immutability, but what if the thing that never changes about God is that he's always moving, always redeeming, always creating and sustaining? So Modus Dei should really reshape everything, especially our theology. God is not just present, but he's also presencing. He's continually making himself known. And so to know the God who moves is to be drawn into his movement towards deeper devotion because he's always near, and also towards deeper mission because he's always going, he's always sending. And Jesus gives us this wonderful picture of the Modus Dei in Matthew 16, where he says, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail. I mean, I've never heard anyone explain this before, but it's a pretty simple metaphor that Jesus is saying. Gates are stationary. The image is a church that is moving, is multiplying, and the gates of hell cannot withstand. Anyways, I wish we could geek out more on Modus Dei theology. This is also from Alan. You've probably seen this before. This idea is stimulating our movemental imagination. This flows from the Modus Dei, but this is the primacy of Christology, right? Where Jesus's identity and mission define the church. We do the opposite. We tend to traditionally, what do? We plant a church, and we think through our mission. Okay, we want to reach the people in our neighborhood, and so then we find ways to share Christ in order to bring people to our church. And the problem is, as as Mike Frost says, that this is more marketing than it is mission, right? If you start with church, mission easily gets lost. But when you emulate Christ on mission, then the church emerges. So when we say Christ is the primal model, we're talking about the church that is shaped around Jesus's lifestyle and ministry, not just dogma. Jesus says something really important in Matthew chapter 8. He says, the foxes have holes, the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's not just saying that Jesus is poor, but that he's unhoused and he's mobile. He doesn't temple among us; he tabernacles among us. Right in John 1, he's mobile, and so this mobile, movemental life and ministry that Jesus sets is the pattern that we follow. But of all the issues that keep us stuck in one form of church that is really difficult to multiply, it's probably our pastor-centric ecclesiology. Our assumptions about leadership. They shape our theology more than we realize. And it's interesting, if you look at and you study leadership, where that even that term in English, where it comes from, that term itself emerged with the industrial management theories in the 19th century. And so if we've been influenced by secular leadership theories, then we need to return to an understanding of biblical headship. And Jesus, he's very instructive on this. In Matthew 20, Jesus is looking around and he's critiquing the Roman style hierarchical power around his disciples. He says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. He's not just talking about servant leadership, right? We all get servant leadership. Jesus is reconfiguring structures of authority away from that solo heroic leader model. Remember isomorphism, right? Where our churches tend to mimic corporations. And it's no wonder that our pastors tend to function like what? A CEO. This also tends to impact how we do Bible translation. The word office is not in this text at all. Bill Mount says this, that the type of person defined in 1 Timothy 3 is a person who is morally pure and able to guide the church. This is a far cry from Ignatius's institutional hierarchy that equates obedience to the bishop with obedience to God. Right? A movemental structure or a more organic system does not require offices. Right? I guess office and role are not necessarily antithetical, but you don't need that in an organic system. Leadership is a role and a responsibility, not a rank-based title. Yin Kai, who is a very well-known movement catalyst in East Asia, he says this, when you get a group of believers together in the same room and then you call one person a pastor, everyone else sits down, right? That's not what we want in movements. And I'm taking a lot of this from Lance Ford. He posted something on Facebook. I know you can't read this. This was like 2 weeks ago, and I just thought it was a nice little summary. He said this. I'll just go through it quickly. When you read the New Testament carefully, you notice something strange. There's no senior pastor role, no centralized authority figure, no command and control leader, no CEO apostle, no permanent hierarchy. What do you see in the New Testament? You see teams of leaders, plural leadership, mutual submission, communal discernment, open debate, shared teaching, distributed authority. Even Paul submits his revelation to the Jerusalem community. Even apostles are corrected. Even leaders are confronted publicly. So what have we done? We've replaced it with, again, this is isomorphism, right? One man rule, corporate boards, executive staff hierarchies, branding empires, leader immunity cultures. Oh, that's an awful one. And then we slap Bible verses on top. We didn't drift into this. We chose it because it was more efficient, easier to control, easier to scale, easier to brand, easier to fund, but it wasn't more faithful, right? God's already given us that blueprint for the church. The church is supposed to have this role in society that's apostolic, that's prophetic, that's evangelistic, that's pastoral, and that's instructional. But what have we done in our theology, in our institutional theology? We've just exiled those previous roles, the apostolic and the prophetic and the evangelistic, and everything is just collapsed into that shepherd teacher, which is our pastor-centric ecclesiology. Now, there's a lot of ways to mess up there's a lot of ways to mess up who's an apostle today. I want to distance myself from the. We've already a lot of people on this call are aware of the New Apostolic Reformation. It's a heretical movement. That's not what it is. But it doesn't mean that we throw the apostles out the window. It's the same thing. There's a lot of bad pastors. Well, you don't just toss out pastoring. We need them all, right? It's the apostles and the prophets and the evangelists, and these are the ones who catalyze or initiate movement, and then movements are sustained by shepherds and teachers. We need the whole ecosystem, all of Christ's ministry. We need it together. So I was just going to share a little bit of myself here, and I'm done, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Uh, you can get in touch with me, Wes at onecollective.org. Been serving with them for 25 years, and I hope they give me a plaque this year. So my boss is on this call, so hint, hint. But I'm going to end there, and I haven't been following, but I'm looking forward to your questions, looking in the chat.
Absolutely. So we'll just open it up for questions. If you feel more comfortable putting it in the chat, feel free. If you are brave and you want to unmute and share your question, we're totally open for that.
Hi, Wes. This is Tom. I'll
Hi,
just
Tom.
jump. Can you hear me?
Yep, good to see you.
A very quick question. Earlier on, you stated that the church has lost 40 million. Is that within the Western church, within the North America? I think it's lost 40 million people in the last century. So I assume that you're saying within the
No,
last 100 years. Are you
no,
talking
yeah,
about the church in the U.S.
yeah.
or the Western church in general? Anyway.
So that stat comes from the Great De-Churching, and that book came out 2 years ago. So it is not that's in the last that was in the first 24 years of this century. So that's this century alone. The church in North America has lost
North
40.
America.
The,
Okay.
the church has lost 40 million members. So
Okay.
and Ryan Burge is on that. I follow him on Substack. He's got so much great stuff out there. You hear a lot these days of like this Gen Z revival, and if you follow, I mean, we don't have enough data yet, but it seems like there's a slight uptick in Gen Z church attendance among men. But there's really no revival. We're still in a place of decline. The numbers of people who call themselves Christians has stayed steady. So Pew Research has showed that in the last 5 years, we're not declining, but church closures, and church attendance is still decreasing dramatically. And yes, I could put this together in a PDF and send this out. Thank you, Chris. Oh, Carly. Yes, thank you for the plaque. Thank you, Carly. Tell
Wes,
Scott, all right? Yeah, Chris.
I just had a question from your research, kind of combining, some of the institutional elements, buildings, denominations and movement in the majority world. I wonder if you have any examples, just thinking of places that are like Kenya or somewhere where there's already a significant amount of kind of even evangelical world, but there's also, movemental expressions of church. Have you seen places where those two worlds have worked well, played well together? Any examples in your research from the majority world?
Yeah, so in the majority world, there's so many different types of movements. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia, you've got like almost everybody who's trying to do church and who's doing a good job equipping people. They're seeing movement happen in those types of contexts. So yeah, there's places where they tend to work well together, but like in South Asia, for example, there's just the population is growing so dramatically that if you're not seeing movement in what you're doing, no matter what you're doing, you really need to rethink it. What I like about the CPM or DMM conversation is that these are movements in unreached contexts, and I think that is closer to our context in our post-Christian West. So I think it's a less of a jump. So there are, and your question, Chris, is more about like how an institutional church can also do movements, and both of those kind of exist together at the same time.
Or at least play well together, encourage.
Yeah. I
Kind
mean,
of what you're speaking of.
yeah, we need to fight for unity. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that a lot of times in the movements conversation, people throw the institutional church under the bus. People, you might have felt that I did that here. I really try not to. Whereas in the institutional side of things, it's like, oh, movements, it's okay. You guys are micro church. That's all. That's a fad. That's going to go away. So we need more of trying to play together in the West. And I'm not familiar with too many models, but like, here in Chicagoland with the yellow box, they're doing with Rodrigo, they're trying to do their micro church expression that runs alongside their Sunday service kind of a thing, and to create a place where one doesn't try to control or influence or dictate what happens to the other. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, but not many case studies. Like I said, and I'm also borrowing Alan's term there. There's not really a good proof of concept for us to learn, especially in North America.
Yeah, there's 2 questions in the chat if you want to jump in there, Wes.
Okay.
From Lance and Jean.
Okay, let me read Lance's. How would you encourage movement leaders in the global South to avoid the original simplicity fallacy while better communicating to the global North how the model is biblical and working? Yeah, that's a good question. I think sometimes, I don't know, Lance, how would you answer that?
Nice try. Don't try to be like Jesus to me.
Somebody showed a book to me once called about all the questions that Jesus asked. So
Yeah, that was me. Thanks.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that over spiritualizing and demonizing the other side never helps. I think that yeah, just persisting in prayer and continuing to communicate uh, where they're getting their theology from in the Bible, and sharing their testimonies of God's goodness and what they're doing, and eventually believing we're going to see it happen in the West as well.
Yeah, I mean, part of the tension that I feel in the whole movements conversation is uh, it's really like, if anybody ever says we figured out the Jesus model, I get a little suspicious about that. Just because you're having a lot of fruit, I really want to be careful about that. There's so much that we don't know, that we're blind to, that we need other people sharing their perspectives. And so it's not just, we just do what I read the Bible, do what it says, and then that's it. I mean, if you're in that kind of a mindset, I mean, and you've seen some fruit, I would say let's keep going. We need more longitudinal research that takes place over like a decade or 2 decades of one movement, just to see how it morphs and changes, to see how their theology develops. So a lot of like times in a really simple understanding of church, there's like this really principled biblicism, like we're just going to read the Bible and do what it says kind of a thing, but they don't realize how culturally conditioned they are. And I think it's more mature to see after a period of time, they're going to get into a place where they're doing their own local theologizing, and they're starting to mature in that. Where it goes downhill is when you get into the dogmatic theology and trying to say, well, we're teaching Reformed theology, or we're teaching dispensational theology, kind of a thing, to like early church movements. And I think that's inappropriate. You really need to start with obedience-based discipleship, reading scripture, trying to do what it says. But it's a starting point. We need to look at the telos. So that's kind of my message for some movement catalysts, to answer your question, Lance.
Thank you.
And I think Jean had a question, having a hard time understanding what you're talking about, different small group churches or network churches. Yeah, just in small group, like you're talking about a simple church with maybe 15 people. Like in a network, you've got like there in this village, there's a church of 15, or maybe in a bigger village, there's 2 churches of 15, and then this other church, but they're networked together, and there's usually some sort of person who has oversight or eldership over that kind of network of house churches. So they're interdependent. So that would be the difference between those two. Gabriel, can you expand more on how one's Christology can determine missiology and then ecclesiology? I'm working among Hindus, and I think they would appreciate this. Wow. Okay. I want to ask who's done a lot of teaching on this. Maybe I can get Brian. Brian can with 100 movements can unmute and explain this.
That feels like a really big question that you just tossed to me with zero prep, Wes. I'm trying to learn here, brother.
Uh-huh.
Can you expand more on how one's Christology can
It's just, I think,
determine?
explaining that Alan's
Yeah,
diagram.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would say, oof, I don't want to take too long on this, but this idea of Christology, of just returning to Jesus in everything, and not just his message, but his methods, they inform every aspect of our life. Um, it's something really our community here in Kansas City has been spending a good bit of time on lately. Um, I it matters for Hindus, it matters for Westerners, it matters for global South, global wherever you live. There's this invitation to continually return to that element of Jesus as Lord.
Yeah.
He has full authority over every aspect of our life. So, I was actually doing a little writing on this yesterday around. I think that Old Testament Shema, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is informing all of that life. Jesus is the embodiment of that for us. Like it's a New Testament claim that you get authority over my relationships, my vocation, my parenting, my finances, how I spend my time, where I spend my time, who I spend my time with. But I am continually returning to not just what you said, but how you did it when you were in those spaces and places.
Hmm.
Uh, what did he do among the poor? Why was he there? And how did that even inform who he was? And that begins to form who I am, which sends me in that missional space. I don't want to just go because Jesus said, I want to go like Jesus said.
Yeah.
And to make disciples, the form of the church is just that. It's just a form that emerges out of that new expression of extended family that emerges. Um, I don't know how that applies
Yeah, that
specifically to the Hindu context, but
Yeah, that's good, Brian. I mean, this is not so much a like a Muslim context or a Hindu context, Gabriel, how I'm meaning it. It's more there's this common criticism against movement thinking from the institutional church in the West. And one guy said very famously, he said, movement people are sloppy at defining what a church is. And if you're sloppy when in defining what a church is, then people will go to hell because of your errors. And that's really starting with your church, right? I thought our salvation was dependent on Jesus, not the church, right? That's would be my pushback on that. We're constantly coming back to Christ and recalibrating everything we do around him.
That's great.
Thanks, Wes.
We probably have time for one more question.
I'm really happy to see a couple friends from our micro church. We have a micro church here in Wheaton, and it's a bit ironic because this is the Mecca. We're starting another church in Wheaton is like starting another mosque in Mecca, right? So, but there's most of our churches in Wheaton, they're geared towards the same percentage of people who would ever consider it plausible to step inside foot of an evangelical church. Well, we'd like to see our church multiply in unexpected places and have forms where we could model things for people in ways that they could do themselves, right? So in a decentralized network, any part should be able to reproduce the whole. Myself, thinking of the Hindu analogy, I'm meeting next week with a refugee family. They're here in Chicagoland. I would not from Syria. They live right near us in Beirut, apparently, for a number of years. And I would not bring them to a big institutional church. And it's not because I don't love the church, right? I love the church, but I know the culture shock that they get when they go in there. I mean, I'm at the spot where I'm getting culture shock when I go into these churches now. Like but if they came into our micro church, our house church, and it was more informal, then they have a model, I think, of something that they could reproduce. and something that's more focused on discipleship, disciple making. So, yeah. The institutional church always persecutes the movement. Can you comment on this? Yeah, I mean, I just think, Mark, it's just it's always a power dynamic, right? I don't see it too far different than the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. There's just and that famous saying from Upton Sinclair, it's difficult for a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it, right? There's power, there's ecclesionomics, right? Money, all sorts of these things. When we feel threatened, we're not afraid to change, we're afraid of loss. And so if we're going to lose something, if this conversation is threatening, we're going to lose something, that's when we can lash out. And I think that's kind of part of the dynamic. But also it has to do sometimes with the way movements people communicate that can tend to be really polemical in nature. And so we all need to do a better job of being more gracious and thinking through the bigger picture together.
Great. Well, thank you, Wes, for sharing so much knowledge. Appreciate the other people who came in and spoke about various pieces. Wes, I'm going to share this recording with you and a follow-up email, as well as ways you can get in contact with Wes to follow up and also connect with Modus Dei Network and 100 Movements. So we are so excited that you guys participated and took some time this afternoon, and we will go ahead and release you. So thank you so much. It was great to see you all. Look forward to a follow-up email from me.
Thanks, everyone. Really honored that you're all here.
Thanks, Wes.
Bless you.
Thank you all.